Hey, welcome to the Ten Commandments Bible Study. This is day 13, our outward estate, the eighth commandment. We're going to take a trip into your pocketbook today. We're going to talk about money and effort and obtaining wealth and things like that. So the very first question here, if you have your curriculum out, you might want to look at the first question the Catechism presents us is, what is the eighth commandment? Well, the eighth commandment is, you shall not steal. That's Exodus chapter 20, verse 15. So what is required in the eighth commandment? Again, you know that it's easy to say what's forbidden because you can just quote the commandment, right? You shall not steal. But as we've seen, the Catechism helps us to unpack the idea. And so now we're going to look at what is required by us to keep this commandment. So the eighth commandment requires the lawful procuring and furthering the wealth and outward estate of ourselves and others. So the lawful procuring and furthering the wealth and outward estate of ourselves and others, just like the other catechisms, the other questions and answers, we've had the chastity of ourselves and others, the life of ourselves and others, the honor of ourselves and others. So here we have the similar kind of idea, the outward estate of ourselves and others. So let's look at this. Lawful procuring. What in the world are we talking about? Lawful procuring. Romans chapter 12, verse 17, and Proverbs chapter 27, verse 23 kind of give us an idea about that. If you read those, and then we'll ask the question here. If you look at Romans chapter 12, there's that word honest that appears there. What does honest and diligent work, what part does honest, diligent work play in our spiritual life? Paul says in Romans 12, recompense to no man evil for evil, provide things honest in the sight of all men. Honest as opposed to what? As opposed to cheating? As opposed to kind of going around the rules a little bit, bending things to my own way? So I'm providing things honest in the sight of all men. And then Proverbs chapter 27 talks about diligence in work. What part does honesty and diligence play in our spiritual life? Is it good for us spiritually? I guess that's kind of the question that I want to hit at here. Is it good for you spiritually to be honest in your dealings financially and to be diligent in your work? Now we come to the outward estate of others. We understand the honesty and diligence that's required to further our own estate, but what about the estate of others? What about the outward estate of others and their wealth? Well, Leviticus chapter 25, verse 35, if you want to read that, and then in Philippians chapter 2, verse 4, we'll look at that passage. It looks like here that the Bible is showing us that we have a responsibility to our neighbor and their wealth and outward estate. If your brother be waxen poor, it says there in Leviticus, fallen into decay, and you are to, look at that, there's a command there, you shall relieve him, though he be a stranger, that he may live with you. So our duty then not only is to protect them, but is to provide for them when they can't provide for themselves. So to provide things honest, the procuring of honest wealth, the honesty and the diligence that produces that wealth is to be used to help others who have fallen on decay, who can't do it for themselves. Now, the question here is, how can we help others improve their outward estate? Well, the very first thing there is we have to help them. We have to take them under our wing. And then Philippians chapter 2 instructs us we're not to look on our own things, but every man on the things of others. So we're to be involved in their life and help them improve their outward estate. There are lots of ways we can do that. What role then does this play in our spiritual life? Is this something that we need to consider spiritually? Absolutely. Because the commandment here, the eighth commandment teaches us, you shall not steal, but it requires us not only not to steal, but it requires us to think through and intentionally think about honesty in our dealings, diligence in our work, providing for those who don't have, and helping them with whatever they need. So yeah, this is a spiritual discipline. What role does it play in your life? So think about that in regards to your life. What role does taking care of the outward estate of others play in your life? And then our third question here in the Catechism, the forbidden question. You might say to me, now, Pastor, we don't need to read that. I already know the answer to that question. Well, maybe not. Let's look and see what it says. The 8th commandment forbids whatsoever does or may unjustly hinder our own or our neighbor's wealth and outward estate. Okay, the 8th commandment forbids whatsoever does or may. So whatever is doing right now, the does, this is the action word, right? Or may, this is the word of potential. So what might potentially unjustly hinder my outward estate or the outward estate of my neighbor? Well, let's think about our own outward estate first of all. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8, if any man provide not for his own house, or provide not for his own, especially for those of his own house, he has denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. Yes, sir, this comes right over into our spiritual life, doesn't it? You've denied the faith if you don't provide for yourself and for those of your own house. And so there are lots of ways that can happen, whether it is actually happening or whether there is a potential for it to happen. There are lots of things in this world that want your money and want to take it in an unjust way. You cannot participate with those things because it may reduce the supply for your house, such as gambling, for instance. You know, you gamble, you say, well, I've got it under control, but do you really have it under control? Because that can hinder the wealth and outward estate of your home. Look at 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8, and also there's another one there, Proverbs 28:19. Again, this goes back to the diligence question. He that tills his land shall have plenty of bread, but he that follows after vain persons shall have poverty enough. So can an individual harm or hinder his own ability to provide for his material needs, and how? So maybe list out some of those things. I mentioned one of them in gambling. Now, there are others that we can identify. Think about that and answer that question there. We've talked about hindering our outward estate. What about our neighbor? The getting of treasures by a lying tongue is a vanity tossed to and fro of them that seek death. That's Proverbs chapter 21, verse 6. I'd like for you also to look at Job chapter 20, 19 and 20. He talks about the man who oppresses the poor and has violently taken away an house. You know, if you're there in Proverbs, you might want to look at Proverbs chapter 1. And the father tells his son not to cast in his lot with those who run after evil. And then we hear the voice of those people, and they say, you know, cast in your lot with us. Let us have one purse. We're going to hide in the secret places and attack the innocent and take their houses and fill our homes with wealth and precious treasure and all of that. You see, that's the idea here, is that hindering our neighbor is doing it by subterfuge, by violence, by lying. So we're using all kinds of method here to take from someone who has for ourselves. And of course, this is the does and the may, both together. It is potential and it is actual. So how does this action, this wealth acquired by dishonest means, affect our neighbor? And then how does it affect the person doing it? Is there a spiritual effect here? Just like is there a spiritual effect on our life through honest and diligent work? Is there a spiritual effect on our life through lying and violently taking away what belongs to someone else? And then for our consider section today, I have this. Are there any avenues of your income that are not consistent with the 8th commandment? That is, that they are not honest and diligent. Well, write those down. What are you going to do today to begin to live according to this commandment? Are there steps that you can take right now to change that course? If you answer yes to that question, Write down the steps that you are going to take. And then for our meditation, we have this. Write down the 8th commandment and the answer to what is required in the Westminster Shorter Catechism. As you go about your day, find time to look at them and rehearse the words to yourself. I'll see you again tomorrow for day 14 on the 10 Commandments Bible Study.